and 3 or 4 members of the Royal Artillery posted here, bringing the number of the garrison up to 29 soldiers. They were here because there was about 65, give or take, cannon, mortars, and howitzers that had been left at this fort after the French and Indian War. 35 of these guns were French, made out of iron. The Ministry of the Navy, realizing, of course, that they need a lot of guns, used iron, which is cheap, in order to build enough cannons to supply navies and forts all over France's colonial empire. 35 of those guns were left at this fort after the French abandoned it to the British, failing to destroy those. Now, the British, they bring more cannon to this fort throughout the 1760s and then early 1770s because their army, due to budget cuts, was no longer large enough to bring all of the artillery out of the Champlain Valley that they'd spent years bringing into it. And so you'd find more iron guns brought to this fort. So eventually, there was about 65 of them in number. Now, many of the guns were certainly mounted on the walls of Ticonderoga, but actually a lot of them were just lying on the ground at the various shipyards around this fort, whether to the south, right below the walls here, or off to the east, where the pavilion is today, where the King's Garden is. Now, in the 18th century, the way that you measure cannons is by the weight of the shot. It makes measuring the gunpowder a lot easier. Now, what's inconvenient about this system is that the French and the British, well, they use 2 different measurement systems. The smallest of the French guns, which we're going to be firing, like this reproduction here, starts with a 4-pounder. So that means it fires a 4-pound cannonball. From there, you would find that there are 6s, 8s, 12s, 18s, 24s, and then 36-pounders at the heaviest. Now, the British system at the smallest, it starts with a 3-pounder, then goes to a 6, a 9, a 12, an 18, a 24, then a 32. And you may be thinking to yourself, well, that's all right. Some of the ammunition is going to translate back and forth. In fact, it does not, because a French pound is actually a little bit more than an English pound. Of course, an English pound is what we use today. Now, with many of these guns simply lying on the ground and not cared for, you'd find that the diameter of the bore of those guns had actually changed, of course, due to corrosion, and it became increasingly difficult to tell the difference between a French 4-pounder and an English 6-pounder, those being the cannon that were most common at Ticonderoga in 1774. Now, it doesn't matter if it's a 4 or a 6, they all have the same parts. So when we say cannon, we are just talking about the tube that fires the projectile. Of course, made out of iron, and then from the muzzle all the way at the front, it has a bore that is drilled or cast all the way to the back, the breech, where the gun is cast the thickest. Now, on the top of the breech, there's another hole called the vent, which is drilled from the top down into the bore, so we can pour a priming charge, of course, to get the gun to actually fire. Right behind the breech, we have the cascabel, doorknob-like looking piece of iron. Helps us move the cannon up off the carriage, of course using a gin or an engine. When lashed with rope, it can be easily moved so that the gun or the carriage can have maintenance performed on it. Now, as I said, the gun is cast thickest at the back, where the breeches are the first reinforce. The second reinforce is just ahead, and at the second reinforce you find the metal begins to thin out so that you can save on weight. And it's here where you have the general tipping point, 2 cylinders of